Well, for a start, I'm not married to photography. The reason I do photography is because it works. If tomorrow it ceases to be effective, I'll get rid of it. I'll pick up whatever tool works at any one particular time. I'll use words, I'll use song, I will use dance, I will use a gun if I have to. I don't think the tool is important. I think you fight using whatever tool, whatever weapon is appropriate at a particular time. And the terrain changes, the battle changes, and you change accordingly. But I will admit that I continue to think that photography is an extremely powerful tool, particularly in conjunction with the written word, in conjunction with the moving image, and many other things. I also recognize that this was the very tool of our oppression, because countries like Bangladesh were represented as poor, starving nations, and that was the only identity we had. We were icons of poverty. And this iconic version of poverty was established and propagated by white Western media and by NGOs. They had their agenda, and we fitted into that agenda in that particular role. So that was why I took on photography in particular. That was why we set up our agency, DRIC, because it was going to be a platform for indigenous practitioners to tell their own stories. Until the lions find their storytellers, stories about hunting will always glorify the hunter. We have started a project called the Rural Visual Journalism Network. So we have 40 correspondents all across Bangladesh, and they work with the iPod Touch. They do multimedia reporting using the iPod Touch. They edit using iMovie on the iPod Touch. They produce these stories together, and we now have over 600 stories from rural Bangladesh, which mainstream media has never addressed. For mainstream media, rural Bangladesh does not exist. And that is the space that we do. And today, our programs are not only published through our own website, but also international media like Deutsche Welle. They regularly, every week, they publish a story about rural Bangladesh. We're doing beta testing with the BBC, with Al Jazeera. And I think that will be the new space of contestation. It's a very unequal world where there is Islamophobia on one hand, and that there is a very distinct effort to keep poorer countries poor, despite all the rhetoric about democracy and freedom and everything else. And at the end of the day, we can't rely on someone else to fight our battles for us. So we have to fight our battles. And photography and journalism and culture happen to be the tools that we use. I think there are 4 major change agents in society. One is politics, quite obviously. The other 3 are media, education, and culture. And while I'm not a politician in the true sense, I want to have an influence on the political system. So our strategic position was to work on the other 3 sectors, media, culture, and education, and ensure that there is constantly pressure applied upon politicians so they cannot get away with the ridiculous things that they do. So in that sense, photography is a very integral part of that process, but not merely in terms of an art form or a media form, but also from a pedagogic process, because I think one of the things we need to do is to educate people in terms of the power of the media and to ensure that they are not duped by mainstream media and all the people who will take on media for their own agenda. For a start, I don't think everyone is telling stories. I think everyone is taking pictures. Not everyone is telling stories. I think many people are pressing the shutter. Not many people are taking photographs. And I'll relate it to much more mundane things. You have a pen, I have a pen. We don't consider ourselves a writer because we happen to have a pen. And I see no reason why one should consider oneself to be a photographer merely because one possesses a mobile phone or a camera or anything of that sort. Having said that, I think what is happening is also interesting from another point of view, because I think it demystifies photography, which is very important to do. I think photography has been taken on board by companies, corporations, camera makers, who try and tell us that the latest camera, the fancy lens, the megapixel chips are what will make us photographers. The fact that you have to have a story to tell, you have to have the heart that wants to tell the story, the head that is capable of thinking out the story, and the talent and the ability to enact that story that makes us the storytellers that we are. So I actually welcome it. I think the fact that many people are there adds to the opportunities that arise. But there is another thing that's also happening, which I find very exciting, because for a long, long time, mainstream media has had too much control. And mainstream media is largely run by corporations, run by politicians, run by people who have very different agenda. And I think the average person with a mobile phone in his or her hand can challenge mainstream media, and I find that very positive. I don't think there is any one reality. There are many realities, there are many truths, and it depends upon what direction you're coming from, what your politics is. Stuart Hall has a very interesting statement. He says, a black man with a black camera does not necessarily take black pictures. And I think it is who we are that determines what we produce. So sure, the photograph and the equipment are very important things at the end of the day, but there is a multiplicity of realities, and we need to unpack it and ensure that the reality that is relevant for us is the reality that is presented. The biggest danger we have is becoming complacent. And part of the problem is that we often stay within our comfort zones, which of course is comfortable by definition, but it also makes you ineffective. And I think for a journalist or anyone wanting to make a change, it's the periphery, the center is not where change takes place. It's always at the periphery. It's also interesting not only in terms of the danger zones, but because the periphery is where the interactions take place with other forms, with other art forms, with other media forms. Those are the spaces of interaction, those are the spaces of contestation, and those are also the spaces for change. So I think a journalist, certainly a photographer, has to be where that edge is. That's also where the heat is, that's also where the danger is, and the challenge is engaging where that boundary is, because if you go too far, you can get burnt. If you stand too far back, you become ineffective. So it is that knife edge where we constantly belong.